The August 23rd Zimbabwe elections are expected to be highly contested as the country faces a myriad of challenges, including a crippling economic crisis, rampant corruption and human rights violations. All this on the back of recommendations post the last election to effect electoral reform, which the opposition argues has not been implemented. Joining me now for more on this is Richard Mahomva, a Zimbabwean academic and the government's Director for International Communication. Richard, appreciate your time this evening. Thanks so much for speaking to us on Africa Today. Let's talk about a state of readiness and preparedness by the Zimbabwe government for this year's elections. How's it all looking?
First, I can safely say it's looking all fine, considering that as of a few days ago, we had political parties making their nomination processes, and that was subsequent to the declaration, the proclamation of the election date by the president. And we have seen political parties also campaigning. And besides that, if you go on social media, if you go on other traditional media, you can see that there's a contested debate, and even print media has been covering issues exclusively in that respect.
Well, the one thing that is obviously topical is, are these elections going to be free and fair? And a big indicator of that certainly is some of the organizations that are invited to observe the elections, and secondly, the number of journalists and media houses across the world that have been granted permission to come in and observe the elections. Speak to us about those two issues.
You'd recall that as of 2018, there was the liberation of the airwaves, courtesy of the Second Republic's overall media reforms. And in that respect, you'd notice that there was a huge flock of media houses that came to cover elections. So there is that particular position that has been taken by the government. And that has also been followed by things like your cabinet briefs, your post-cabinet briefs. So there's this increased sense of transparency around elections, which effectively speaks to an open media space. And also you'd recall that in the advent and in the context of social media proliferation, really much of the broadcast of our content is happening there. So against that backdrop, we'd also see that this will be an election that is going to be predicated on alternative media as well, outside excessive dependence on conventional media. So these are some of the issues that would also ensure that the message from all political parties spreads far and wide.
So I want to take you back to the issue around reforms that were recommended by the Motlanthe Commission of 2018. And I'm just going to read something very quickly here, and it speaks about on around the 1st of August, demonstrators took to the streets of Harare demanding the release of results in elections that had been held a few days before. The demonstration turned into a riot, which was violently suppressed by the police and army. 6 people were killed by gunfire and 35 injured, and there was considerable damage to property. So before we look at the recommendations coming out of that commission, let's talk about those deaths. A number of 6 individuals were killed. Has anybody been brought to book?
For starters, let's start off by even looking at the logic and the merits of the demonstrations. In my personal view, and also as a political scientist, the demonstrations were unwarranted, simply because the Electoral Act clearly states that results are meant to be released 5 days immediately after the election process.
Well, sorry, Richard, allow me to come in there. I don't think the issue really is the fact that people demonstrated. I think the issue at hand is that people were killed, right? So there is no justification for killing people regardless of the fact that they demonstrated against the law or not. The idea behind the law is to apprehend those individuals and put them into prison and not kill them. 6 people were killed. Have the cult priests been brought to book?
The point I want to make is that we need not to be selective in our analysis. The starting point is that the disproportionate violence was a reaction to opposition orchestrated violence. And that is a starting point if we are to be truthful in creating progressive future policies that create peace. So we need to have mutual concessions that the initial cause for the demonstration was unwarranted and was outside the confines of the law. And if the institutions that are responsible for peace and order might have overreacted, we should be able to locate the source of the reaction. So I think that is the starting point.
Well,
now,
I think Richard,
yes,
to suggest...
the perpetrators been brought to book. You would recall that this was a spontaneous sense of violence, and we are saying there are people that lost property, and those people that equally lost property and the state infrastructure that was damaged, there was nothing that was able to be retrieved in that respect. So those are some of the realities that are there. And I'm sure that the Commission, in my view, was able to put a conclusive a future position for peace. And for me, I think that is important, because in as much as we can look for remedies that criminalize certain individuals, what is important is to create policy frameworks and recommendations that result in sustainable peace for our people. And I think the Motlanthe Commission did well in that respect.
Now, you have not answered the question on whether the individuals, the soldiers or the police that shot those civilians were brought to book or not. And the second question is, were the civilians in question armed?
Yeah, but equally I'm saying there are also civilians that destroyed public infrastructure. There are civilians that also...
No, I understand that, Bridget, but you're not answering, you're not answering the question.
It becomes problematic when we only want to focus on one side of delivering justice.
Well,
I think
in all fairness, you didn't give me an opportunity to go to the other side, right? I asked a question. My question was incomplete. Yeah. Right? The first part of my question is, were the soldiers or the police that shot the unarmed civilians brought to book?
Yeah, well, we await processes to occur, because for us to only assume that it was soldiers that were armed in such a chaotic environment, it's problematic and selective in terms of analysis. So I think it's a process that we need to continuously pursue as observers and readers of Zimbabwean politics.
Well, one of the other recommendations that came out of the Motlanthe Commission was the issues around hate speech, abuse of cyberspace and incitement to violence recommendation. And the recommendation was the laws relating to hate speech, abuse of cyberspace and incitement to violence should be reviewed. And what we've seen is the Patriotic Bill, which further limits the rights of individuals. Would you care to comment on that?
I would want to give a twofold comment. The first comment is about hate speech. I think the overall nature of democracy is to create a plurality of voices regardless of our ideological contradictions and differing political persuasions. And I believe whenever people debate, debates should be centered around the national question and not partisan prejudices. I should be able to have contradicting views in terms of a policy that Party X projects, and not to attack people on the basis of my personal dislikes or personal preferences towards them. Then, coming to the issue of the patriotic clause, I think you guys in the media have generously misconstrued this clause for what it is. Basically, this is a legislation that is coming in the form of an amendment of an already existing law in Zimbabwe, which is called the Criminal Codification Act, Criminal Codification and Reform Act of 2006. And this is the main statute that forms the basis of criminal law in Zimbabwe. And how does then the component of the patriotic clause come in? It comes in to challenge willful collaboration with foreign players to bring about unconstitutional regime change. And why is it important and very contextually relevant to Zimbabwe? This is because in Zimbabwe we find ourselves in unique circumstances that gave birth to a foreign legislation that was a product of colonial hobnobbing by a political opposition party that was vested in anti-land reform discourses and found the support of the Western world that was angered by the land reform. And against that backdrop, we saw a situation where Zimbabwe fell victim to an illegal legislation from European countries, and in particular America, through what is called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which is a legislation that is outside the framework of the United Nations. So against that backdrop, Zimbabweans, particularly the parliament, found it important and very prudent to establish this patriotic clause, which is going to punish willful collaboration with detractors of Zimbabwe's national interest.
So, Richard, we're running short of time. I'm going to give you a minute just to walk us through some of the successes of the Second Republic, certainly since President Emmerson Mnangagwa took over. What would you say are the successes of President Emmerson Mnangagwa and his government ahead of these elections, which I assume is what he will be punting during his election campaign?
I think the starting point in the health sector, you recall that we're one of the few countries in the continent that were able to fight COVID and do it successfully through introduction of vaccines and in very constrained, under very constrained economic conditions. You'd also notice that as far as tertiary education is concerned, education 3.0 5.0 is responsible for, making sure that the tertiary education is linked to the industrial needs of our people. And you'd also recall that in the mining sector, Zimbabwe has reconfigured the entire sector towards a 12 billion economy by 2030. And you'd also recall that in the media sector, where you guys are an interested player, there have been several reforms that you have seen about 14 community radio stations and commercial radio stations being launched, and also new television systems and new television players against the backdrop of the monopoly of one broadcaster. And you'd also notice that even in the area of trade, in the area of industry, there's been an ease of doing business that is now courtesy of the Zimbabwe Investment Development Authority. So those are some of the things, and in that particular area, you'd notice that the Manise steel plant has come to life, and it's going to create a whole lot of employment for our people. And there is a whole lot of, I think, developments that are attached to the
Richard, I'm going to have to thank you for your time. We've run short of time on the show, but certainly appreciate you speaking to us on Africa Today. That was Zimbabwean academic and the government's Director for International Communication, Richard Mahomva, speaking to us from Harare.